Here we go.
All right. So welcome to everyone for the last time on those climate talks. This time with a little bit different topic on adaptation of climate change. And I'm Johannes. I'm facilitating this event with Felix. Do you want to say hi, Felix?
Hello, everyone. Also, big welcome from me here online in the Zoom room and on YouTube. Yeah, I will guide you through this event together with Johannes.
That's correct. So yeah, welcome to everyone who's in this room, but also welcome to everyone who's watching this right now or later. I don't know. I hope we will have a lot of fun and we will learn a little bit about the whole adaptation of climate change in Berlin. We'll focus a little bit on the year of 2030 because we're talking, or this is within the BEK 2030, the Berlin Energy and Climate package. And yeah, I think I'll just hand over to Yannick to explain more about the lab concept.
Thank you very much, Johannes, and a big welcome from my side also to today's event, sixth and final, as you mentioned, climate talk on the Young Climate Campus Berlin called Adaptation to Climate Change. Hello to our speakers. Thank you for being here. Thank you for our participants for being here and for everyone who is watching this in the live stream. My name is Yannick Petersen from Lab Concepts, which is the project management agency for the Young Climate Collaboration Berlin project of the Berlin Senate Department for the Environment, Transport and Climate Protection. As you might know, the YCCB project, in short, is a project aimed primarily at young adults between the ages of 18 and 28 to inform them, first of all, about the local climate action measures of the city of Berlin, but also identify open questions and open aspects, which is exactly what we are doing here in these climate talks with our speakers and our participants, of course, and take it from there to then devise their own claims at the Young Climate Conference Berlin, which is open for registration now, by the way. So go to our website where you will find the registration form. It's taking place on the 17th and 18th of June in a digital format. So do go to berlin.de/young-climate-conference, where you will find all the relevant information. The project is embedded into the Berlin Energy and Climate Protection Program 2030, in short, the BEK 2030, which again is an important milestone on Berlin's pathway to becoming a carbon neutral city by the year 2050. And we have been focusing on 5 of the 6 action areas in this program so far, and are dealing today with the final and 6th action area, adaptation, as I mentioned before. Just a few more words. We also have an Instagram channel, so please find us at YCC Berlin, where young media agents are creating their own content management on the action areas and the topics that I have just talked about. And last but not least, of course, a big hello to our YouTube audience as well. So feel free to post your questions that you might have also in the YouTube live stream chat, because we will also be keeping an eye on that and hopefully be able to feed your questions into this talk. I myself won't be talking that much during the event, but I will definitely listen very carefully, because I will be filling in our virtual whiteboard called Miro that we have, which has been developed further and further over the course of this campus, and where we already have considerable input and great questions collected that we will take with us to the conference. And I hope that time will allow us at the end to also get a quick glimpse at that whiteboard and see what we have harvested during this talk. That is all from my side. I'm wishing everyone a very nice and successful event, and I'm handing back to the moderation, Johannes and Felix. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, in general, if you have any questions, not only at YouTube, but also here, you can obviously raise your hand like this or do it with those reactions in Zoom. This talk kind of lives from interactive or being interactive with each other. So we're not only going to talk to Sophie and Dala, but you can also do that, obviously. Yes, so to start with a little bit of interaction, we want to do a small energizer. And for that, we ask you to stand up and find something around you that reminds you of adaptation to climate change. Not easy, probably, but you get a few seconds.
Oh yeah, I should have thought about that.
By the way, Felix and me didn't talk about it before.
You didn't, okay.
No, we didn't. But I think Felix' plant is alive, mine is dead.
But just about to die, let's say.
What do other people have? A bottle, yeah. A book with public transport.
Just to tell you that this actually is the BEK 2030. So yeah.
I only have it as a PDF. Nice, a bicycle, a hat. And I forgot how this is called. An umbrella, obviously. Nice, thank you. All right. Well, I'd say from that, I'll hand over to Felix.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Johannes. So I would like to introduce you a bit to today's topic because we already had some other topics. I'll refer to them in a bit, but so what is this all about? Well, we know that we have to do what we can do to stop to prevent the worst impacts of climate change. So this is what's going on right now, but we also know that we can't avoid all impacts of climate change, of the climate crisis. So we know that parallel to mitigation, we have to deal with adaptation. So this is something that we cannot avoid, and especially Berlin has some fields where this has to happen regarding rain water, regarding heat stress, regarding health risks, and so on. So there's quite a lot going on here where we have to adapt, but we can adapt actually to looking at, do we want a transformation by design or by disaster? So I guess we all agree that we want to have a transformation by design and not by disaster. So we're really happy to have our experts, Sophie Gebb and Dala Nickel here. We'll give you a little introduction later on. So this is where we then are going to get into the questions of how can we adapt to the impacts of climate change, looking at infrastructure, looking at health systems, looking at how the city as such, but also the individuals can deal with that connected to the BEK. We also refer to that again in a bit. Before we deep dive into the topic, I would like to say that as part of the YCCB, it's very important for us that we refer to our code of conduct. So for us, it's a space where we really would like to mingle, to kind of get an idea of other people, of our experts, exchange thoughts. And so we don't tolerate harassment or discrimination in any form. This is very clear. And so if you find yourself uncomfortable or if you read something that kind of is not okay for you, just right now here you can talk to write to either Johannes or me, but you can also write to the YCCB@labconcepts.de email address. So that's another important point for us. So before then, already starting with the questions, Johannes will give us a small introduction to the two experts we are glad to have here today.
Yes, so on my, well, she's beneath me right now, but on the one side, we have Sophie Gepp. She is a medical student at the Charité Berlin and is doing her MSc in public health. She did that actually before, and now she's doing her PhD. And also she's working on her as a member of the extended board of the German Climate Change and Health Alliance and part of the organization team of the Planetary Health Academy. In addition, she is part of the coordination group of the Youth Network for Public Health and works throughout Germany and internationally on the integration of planetary health into the curriculum, well, into the plans of the universities. Say it in easier words. She also works in the areas of gender equality, climate change, and health. So thanks for being here. On
Hi,
the other
thanks
side,
for having me.
yeah. On the other side, this time actually next to me, from my point of view at least, is Dr. Dala Nickel. She already holds a PhD in technical environment protection, and her main areas of work include urban water management strategies for adapting to climate change, urban development, and communication. She initially worked for many years as a scientist as well as in municipal and political consulting. And since 2018, she has been the head of the Berlin Rainwater Agency, which as a new Berlin service point supports the implementation of climate-adapted rainwater management. So hello.
Hello, thank you for the nice introduction. Glad to be here.
Well, and because I now explained who is here, I'll just hand over to Felix again.
Yes, to get ourselves into the mood, we kind of already brought a piece of something in front of the camera, but to kind of get ourselves into the content of adaptation to the impacts of climate change, at least for those who are here and those who join us on YouTube, you can use a pen or a paper. For the rest of us, I would like you to take just a moment to write down a few words or a sentence regarding whatever comes up to your mind when you think about adaptations to climate change. So just the first thing that comes up to you. For those who are in Zoom, you can write it actually into the chat. That would be nice. You can write it into the chat. And then in around 1 minute, I'll just say, all right, and then you can send your associations unless you don't want to share them. So I think we all can do that. And in a way, this is the dragon dreaming style. Let's not overthink it. Whatever comes to your mind first, you can write it down. We will join you as well in doing that. All right, I'll give you another 20 seconds and then we'll finish this sort of brain writing exercise. Okay, whoever has written into the chat can send now. All right, we have green infrastructure, eco heat stress, eco-friendly, better life, health, nature, rethinking urban stress. Yeah, a lot of heat, stress. Sorry?
Sorry? Yeah,
No.
I was just curious about the Tempelhofer Feld one.
Oh, well, I just, before, when we prepared, Felix and me, we talked about the Tempelhofer Feld and how it's a cooling area for the city. And so it's the first thing that came up.
Okay, great. Wildfire prevention, urban planning, shade, water accessibility. Yeah, resilience. So there's a lot of things that kind of guide us very well, I would say, into what we're going to talk about now. So in the past sessions, in these events, we have talked about consumption, for example, as part of the Berlin Energy and Climate Protection Program 2030, the BEK, which is kind of easier and nicer to say, BEK 2030. So we talked about consumption, for example, energy, housing, and how all these fit together. And today, I think it's really interesting to have the cross-sectoral kind of dimension of health and also then infrastructure that kind of fits really well together in what we are going to look at during the next years, because some of the things are just coming and it's not so much about what we want or not, but we have to deal with it. So this is really what we want to talk about today. So the BEK refers to the adaptation and to the health situation in many ways, as Yannick has already referred to. So there are different options how we can deal with them, and this is what we're going to talk to you about today. So we want to hear what you think Berlin should do, can do, what measures work, how we could include citizens into this whole process, how social injustice plays a role. There are big questions, and of course you can't answer all of them, but I think it's a very rich content that we can make use of today. So let's get started. Johannes?
Definitely. So after, I don't know how many, like 20 minutes of talking, I'll hand over with questions to everyone else. So at first we try to find like what's happening right now, or what do we think how the future will look like without doing something. So my first question is going to Sophie, and it is pretty simple. What climate-induced health risks are there coming towards us?
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for having me. So I think it depends where you look at, and since we're now looking at Berlin, I concentrate on what's hitting us probably the most. So heat is probably one of the biggest health threats that is coming, and where we also see that there's already going to be quite a change, even if we act now, which we definitely have to do, because otherwise it's going to be worse. But heat waves are going to become more frequent, and since we're in a city, the city doesn't cool down at night, so this means stress for the body, and all of these heat waves mean an increased risk for people who already have health conditions with the lung, with the heart. We do know that there's higher mortality during heat waves. In the summer of 2003, there are, depending on how you estimate it, in Europe, 40,000 to 70,000 deaths just due to heat. But there's also just an immense pressure on everyone. I mean, I think all of us know how tough it is to work in a heat wave, to sleep, and it's just really straining the body. And we have dehydration as a huge issue. So people that are not being taken care of, or that can't really take care of themselves well, have a high risk of dehydration. And all of this can lead to many more people showing up in the emergency rooms, and then the health system having to deal with that. And so, yeah, I think we'll get to what we can do about this a bit later, but this is heat is definitely one of a huge health risk for that's going to come, and that's already there now. Another thing is probably extreme weather events, so flooding or fires that we've also already seen in Brandenburg are quite are health hazards. And then one thing that I'm not a specialist in, so I can't really go into detail in this, but due to different temperatures, we have a different pattern of disease. So vector-borne diseases, which is basically any disease that is transmitted via another thing, so a tick or an insect or a mosquito, depend on whether the animal or the vector can actually live in the area, and whether then the conditions are well for the disease also to be transmitted by this. And when these conditions are changing, the likelihood that this is possible again of many illnesses that we only think of as they're far away, they're in the tropics, of them coming up again and us having to deal with them are much higher. So these are some of the examples that could come. However, I know we're only talking about adaptation, but I also want to stress that the extent of what is coming is really in our hands. So there are some things that are already unfortunately inevitable, but we have to really make sure that it's not getting worse, because it's such a difference and will make to our health. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Doesn't sound really as much pleasure, but to get it a little bit better into my head. So right now we have the Corona crisis, and we have already problems since a year with the health system and too many people in hospitals and stuff. So can you kind of relate what's coming up to us with the situation right now?
It's hard to compare, because coronavirus is an infectious disease, and many of the things that are, for example, our problems with health are so-called non-communicable diseases. So diseases that I can't transmit to you or you can't transmit to me. But I think there's a similarity in the fact that, for example, in the case of heat waves, we will have an increased pressure on the health system. We have a lot of people showing up in the emergency room, and doctors and nurses and healthcare staff having to deal with this. And another similarity I see, because I also work in the hospital and will work in the hospital, is that it's going to be very exhausting to work in a heat wave. So right now in coronavirus situations, when you wear all the protective gear, this is really exhausting shifts. And I think if you work in a heat wave and your hospital doesn't have any kind of cooling strategy, this is going to be really, really exhausting shifts. And lastly, I think one big maybe one similarity and one difference. So one similarity is that prevention, or taking care of it before, is always better than dealing with a large amount of people showing up at the hospital. So prevention is always the best medicine, but we also learned in this pandemic that it's always quite underrated. But I would make the case for it here again. And one difference is probably that the measures might look very different. So while we want to isolate old elderly people that are vulnerable in the coronavirus situation, in COVID-19 situation, we actually do not want that in a heat wave, because we can't take care of them, and maybe they're not, we can't see early signs of dehydration, etc. So then there might be a problem if actually crises are converging. So if we have a pandemic situation, but also heat wave, it might get really complicated what the best public health measures are going to be. So yeah.
Thank you. And I'll go over to Dala. And to you, the question: how will the climate crisis impact the city of Berlin, and what must we do to minimize the dramatic impacts of the climate crisis in the city?
I think a number of the issues have been pointed out already, but I would like to maybe take a different look at them, or from a different point of view. We have the problem with heat stress. This is really one of the greatest problems that is arising from climate change that we have already in Berlin today. We already see a very high increase in the number of tropic nights and very hot days. And these will be increasing by 2 to 3 times, by the end of this century. So I think this is definitely the topic that we need to address first and foremost. And what one also needs to know is that the city is often much hotter than the surrounding countryside. 4 to 5 degrees is not unusual. And why is this the case? This is the case because the city is highly sealed. We have sealed surfaces. They absorb the heat. And we have less green spaces to cool the city. But not only that, and here I come to the topic which I deal with most often, we have a disturbed water cycle. So when it does rain, the water is not retained in the soil, where it can be absorbed and taken up by the trees and evaporated or evapotranspirated to cool the city. Rather, it flows off on the surface, enters the sewerage, or we have a flooding event. But in any case, the two issues hang together. So we have the highly sealed surfaces. This increases the heat stress that we experience in the city. But when we have heavy rain events, and we also know that these will be increasing in Berlin, perhaps not to the same degree that we see heat increasing, but this is one of the results of climate change. And when we have heavy rain events, and these will be increasing in intensity and in the number of events that we see, then we experience flooding. But not only that, we also experience in Berlin, and this is a very big issue and has always been an issue, also in the past without climate change. We have wastewater and stormwater flowing into the surface water bodies within the city because we have a combined sewerage in the city center. And we have 30 to 60 such events a year, and have invested hundreds of millions to reduce the combined sewage overflow. And due to the intense rate of building that we have, the intense rate of sealing that we have in Berlin, the combined sewage overflow is rather increasing rather than decreasing. This is something that we have to do something about. This is an environmental issue, but it is also a health issue because via bank filtration, we get our drinking water from the surface water bodies in Berlin. So these are the things that both of them have to do with rain. Too little rain, too much rain, and a disturbed water cycle that we have to do something about in Berlin. And perhaps the good news is there's a common denominator, and that's how we deal with rain.
Thank you. What do you think, what has to change so we can adapt to it, actually?
Well, what has to change is that we start to see rain as a resource, not something that we can just allow to flow out of the city, but something that we need to retain in the city to make better use of it. We can maybe go into a bit detail later on, but to make better use of it, I mean to allow it to infiltrate into the groundwater, to replenish our groundwater resources, to allow the green, the urban green, to have a better access to water. So that the health of our urban green is higher, to cool the city. But we also need to make sure that the stormwater retains or remains in the city to decrease the stress to the sewerage so that we do not experience such combined sewage overflows. That's what we need to do. And we also need to change the way we use urban spaces. So do we want to use urban space to retain stormwater in the city, or do we want to use urban spaces to provide parking for cars? These stand in direct conflict with each other. Both of them require space. We see that we need to change transportation, also looking towards climate change to reduce the change to climate. But we also need urban spaces in order to provide space for managing stormwater. So those, I think, are the issues that I'm looking at. Of course, there are other issues, but there I'm not an expert.
Okay, so what I learned when I was younger, that water is just coming and I have nothing to do, will change in the future, probably. Yay.
Definitely the case.
It's kind of sad, but it's interesting at the same time, for me at least. But I'll hand over to Felix.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot for the introduction to the topic each. Yeah, it really reminds me of in 2019 I used to live at Hermannplatz. I don't know if probably most of you know it, and that was the first time I experienced I don't know how you call it, like a really heat trapped night, I would say, where it just didn't cool down, and I had, I don't know, above 30 degrees at 3 o'clock, and it was horrible. So I think I can, and maybe quite a lot of you can relate more and more to what you're also now sharing here with us. That's really, really interesting. Also, I think a lot of what we can relate to is the space problem, the trade-off, because this is what we deal with every day. When we walk to work, to school, to university, we see space, and it's, for us, it's kind of easy to think about how we want to use them. I think that's something we can relate to very well. So thanks for the introduction. So I would like to open the space to the audience. Yannick, if there are any questions from YouTube, but also here from those who are part of the Zoom community. if you have any questions, feel more than free to ask them. There are any question or even a comment is welcome. I'll give you a short moment to think of a question, and then just feel free to ask them. Right, I see some people writing. Feel free to either write them into the chat or to also just raise your hand and ask them verbally. Yeah, Isabella, go ahead.
Yeah, can everyone hear me? I had a question for Darla. I was just wondering, when you say rainwater is a resource, do you mean capture the rainwater and kind of convert it back into the water table or into groundwater? Or do you mean capture it and use it more as like drinking water or repurposing it for us to use?
That's a very good question. I didn't specify, and that's because I think that there's not one solution that suits all situations. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. I think there are, and I think all of us can relate to this as well. The urban area is and also the intensity of the use of urban areas is quite different. And there are lots of things that we can do to treat water or rainwater as a resource. And the one approach that we take in Berlin is what I guess one could use the word coming from Asia, the sponge city concept, to make sure that we try to reinstate the natural water cycle by managing rainwater at the source, by infiltrating rainwater, by capturing it on green roofs, allowing it to evaporate, by also capturing stormwater in ponds, etc. And but one way of using rainwater is also, of course, to technically store rainwater and to use it for various purposes, whether it be in the garden, to actually replace drinking water and use rainwater for watering, or you can use rainwater within buildings to flush toilets. You can use rainwater to wash clothes. That, of course, requires a separate system and a greater effort on the building side. But this is all possible. And depending on what kind of a situation one has, one needs to look at different management approaches. And so that's always the case, depending on what type of an opportunity you have, what type of building project you have going on. You have to look at the conditions and then make a decision on what is the best management solution. So both of what you said is what I mean by using rainwater as a resource.
Great, thanks a lot for the question and the answer. That kind of leads to some questions we will ask later as well, like who's actually dealing with these infrastructures and who can do what. So then there's another question from the chat from Amit, how the current pandemic would impact adaptation strategies to address climate change in Berlin. So thanks for that question. I think it goes kind of into, yeah, maybe I would hand it over to Sophie for a bit, and then if Darla also wants to say something, that's more than welcome. So how do you think the pandemic right now is looking at your field of work is actually also impacting, maybe in a good way, maybe you would say like we know how to deal with things afterwards, but also in a negative way. So yeah.
Yeah, I think what would be ideal if we would go away with it thinking that we need to be more prepared for things that we kind of see coming. So I think in the global health world, it was not an if ever there is a pandemic, but when. And people, it was always kind of tabled like, yeah, pandemic preparedness, this means we have to do stuff now, but there's nothing why we should do it now. And it's not a really attractive issue until there is actually a problem. And I think that's a similar thing with climate change, where we can actually much better predict that things will happen and what we have to do about them. So we have to have heat action plans, preparedness plans. We have to also look at our health system, which is already, I would say, quite narrowed down, quite cut down, and quite under stress in a normal case scenario. So we have to also think about how we change this. And I think there I'm going way into an area that I have no idea of, but also hospitals are built in a very not helpful way. Like there are hospitals which have like glass facing south facades, where you can imagine what happens to patients if they in a hot summer are in one of these rooms. So we also need to look at how we build hospitals. And I'm not an architect, not my area of expertise, but I think that's definitely for health something to look at. And yeah, I hope that we go away with a better idea of preparedness after COVID. Yeah, and again, it might also not be the last pandemic, so we also have to safeguard nature to reduce the risks of further pandemics, and all of this. Yes.
All right, thanks a lot, Dala. I'll hand over to you if you want to add something.
Well, I think Sophie just pointed out absolutely the most important issue with the preparedness and knowing what we do about climate change and what to expect, and knowing that we always are on the worst side of all of the all of what we extrapolate for the future. I think that that is the most important issue. But I also think, on a positive side, that we saw during the pandemic how well we are able to adapt as a society, how quickly we are able to adapt. And I saw that also in my area where, working close to drinking water supply, wastewater disposal, most of us are working in home office and we still manage to keep up these critical infrastructure. And we have learned to work completely differently. We did not use video conferences at all before the pandemic. Hard to believe, but it's the truth. And now we all work at home and we use video conferences all day long, and we've adapted all of our IT systems and everything is working. And really, we did not have a lull in our efficiency during this year or in what we have achieved. Maybe we have achieved even more. And I thought that was quite an interesting effect, that everything that has changed in our way of seeing work. And now when we go back to work again, we're going to be doing desk sharing and all kinds of things that we didn't do in the past. And it wasn't even possible to think about it or talk about it. And so I would like to do adaptation by design, but adaptation by disaster has something to speak for it.
All right. Thanks a lot. Really nice. So I'm really looking forward also to talk about what we then can do to get prepared more in detail. But here also, the thank you in the chat to answering the questions. So again, are there any more questions? We still have some time for it, so still feel free to ask them. And Yannick, also, if you just shout to me if there are questions coming from the online community outside this room. Okay, then we have another question regarding what does the sponge city, what does this mean in the context of climate adaptation? That comes from Ms. Konrad Beck. Maybe you also just want to explain in a second what you mean by the sponge city, or what you still would like to hear from the experts.
I think it's necessary to explain for the public what is going on. What have we to imagine with the sponge city? What is it?
I can happily answer that.
A lot of people don't know, and I think it's necessary to explain what does we mean with it.
Okay, thanks a lot. Yeah, I think Dala is ready to answer that question. Thanks.
The idea behind the sponge city is that that the city behaves like a sponge. So when the rain falls, it absorbs the water like a sponge. And when we need the water, then it gives the water back to us. This is, of course, an idealized picture, but this is the idea behind the sponge city. And it's true that this needs to be explained in better detail. I just briefly touched on it before when I was talking. There are various approaches to turning a city into a sponge. instead of allowing stormwater to run off on the surface and enter the sewerage system, we want stormwater to stay where it falls. And you can use green spaces for this. So you can have the stormwater which falls on paved surfaces like streets or sidewalks, try to transport this to the green spaces where it can then infiltrate into the ground, or it can be taken up by, it can evaporate or be taken up by the vegetation. Green roofs are one of the approaches to creating a sponge on site, on private property. Also, green facades, which are fed by stormwater, which has been stored. Stormwater storage in tanks underground is an approach, as I was talking about before, and then the stormwater can be used for various approaches. But also creating surfaces in the city that are not completely sealed. This is a further approach, or also removing the ceiling, the surface ceiling, removing asphalt, removing the pavement where it is not necessary. And in many, if you walk through the city and look around you, you'll see that there are many spaces which are paved and which increase runoff and which do not allow stormwater to stay on site. And you can ask yourself, why is this area even paved in the first place? It's paved because it's expensive to remove pavement. That's why it's paved, but not because it necessarily has a function today. And of course, there are areas in the city which need to be paved, and which where it's necessary to have pavement. And I think we need to have to look more closely at the way we use urban spaces. And those are the approaches to the stormwater, to the sponge city. But there are others. For example, if you look in Berlin at, and this is a very well-known example, look at the Potsdamer Platz. Now, the Potsdamer Platz was designed according to the sponge city approach already in the 90s. And hardly anyone knows this. Potsdamer Platz is, I think maybe 95 or 98% paved. You wouldn't think it's a sponge city, but all of the buildings have green roofs. A lot of the stormwater that falls on Potsdamer Platz is stored in this water body, which has a natural cleaning system, a natural cleaning biotope. And it's stored in this, also in underground storage tanks, and is used for toilet flushing. And I think something like 70% of the stormwater which falls on Potsdamer Platz evaporates in the course of the year. It may even be a higher amount. So we are talking about this. The only thing that doesn't happen to a high degree on the Potsdamer Platz is infiltration into the surface, into the groundwater, because there's not really much of a connection there. So maybe not a perfect sponge city, but considering that it's the downtown part of Berlin, this is quite amazing. And only during heavy storm events and really heavy storm events is there's a possibility for an overflow into one of the water bodies, but this is not used regularly, not on a yearly basis. The water stays on site. So this is what we mean when we talk about a sponge city. And of course, people that go and visit Potsdamer Platz think that the surface water was created for their enjoyment, which it was. And that's what the sponge city also needs to do. It doesn't just talk about stormwater management. It talks about how can I create biodiversity? How can I create effective green spaces? How can I cool the city? How can I increase livability? All of that is thought together and brought together in the sponge city approach. Health.
Wow. All right. Great. Thanks a lot for that. These answers, many answers that kind of bring also bring us some illustrative examples, such as Potsdamer Platz, where I actually always ride through with my bicycle, and I never thought about it as a sponge city place, because obviously it's very much paved. Great. So unless Sophie wants to say something regarding the sponge city, no, I guess not. I would say, because Dala talked about video conferences, they weren't really part of the game just before, and we had the feedback during other sessions that people felt kind of yeah, they were in video conferences the whole day and looking at the computer. I would say we take ourselves also looking at the health aspects. We take 2 to 3 minutes, and because now it's spring is also there, we kind of invite with some stretching. We can roll our shoulders to say welcome spring and welcome summer, hopefully not too hot yet. We can train for picking fruits in autumn. We can already do some training so we can pick more fruits in autumn. We can also pick some seeds that we kind of like and we want to put in our garden if we have one. I don't have one, but maybe someone has one. And then we can open our arms again to the side to say the last welcome before we go back to looking at our screens, which maybe feels a bit easier and nicer now. Great. So now we had a very strong introduction, and going into details, I would hand over to Johannes.
Thank you. So it already popped up about cars and parking space. And my next question is kind of going to synergies between adaptation and mitigation. So are there any more synergies between those two things that we could do? To both of you.
Synergies. Yes, okay. I think one, I can point out at least one very obvious synergy. I pointed out the one before between transportation and green spaces, for example, or transportation and finding spaces for stormwater management. And I also showed before my bicycle. And bicycle, of course, is more about mitigation, one could think. But we see that now in the city of Berlin, while we are trying to deal with stormwater differently, that we also stand in competition with the building of bicycle lanes, for example, for another form of transportation. So that's why I pointed out the bicycle before. For me, it's also a question of the correct way to adapt. We need to make spaces for both, and that means that we need to make less space for cars, I think. But another approach which has to do with both is cooling. So we can cool technically. We can cool by using energy. We can cool our houses during, using that approach. But we can also cool by making sure that the city is as cool as the surrounding environments, by increasing green in the city, by increasing shade, by improving the fresh air coming into the city. And we can also take a more technical approach to cooling by using green facades, which have a cooling effect for buildings. Green roofs also, because they provide an insulation on the top of the building. But there are also very technical approaches to cooling using stormwater management that have been applied in Berlin in the past. For example, in the physics building in Adlershof, where rainwater is actually used for a kind of, it's called adiabatic heating or cooling. I'm not sure if that's the correct English word, but where the idea behind cooling the city through evaporation is actually transferred to a kind of technical cooling system, which functions extremely well and can cool buildings down to, let's say, 21, 22 degrees. And that is already, quite going back into the comfort zone again, leaving the heat zone. So I think that's also an approach that one needs to look at more closely.
Yeah, I can maybe just, everything of that is totally right. I can just add the health argument to every single one of these things. So because of if we have more active travel, we know that this is really good for people's mental health, but also for reducing risk factors for other diseases. we know that physical activity is one of the best things you can do for your health. And of course, this also means that we have to have safe bike lanes, because road traffic accidents are unfortunately also a health hazard. So if we make a city that is built for bikes, people will like to bike, and then we have much health gains in the prevention of some diseases, but also people will feel better, and this is going to be a benefit to reducing mental health issues. And the same goes for green spaces. So yeah, green spaces are really good for our well-being. I think all of us noticed this, especially in the pandemic. And I think there's a strong argument for this as well, to think about what do we actually want our cities to look like, and what do these things replace. It's streets, it's cars. Cars mean noise and pollution. Both of them are really bad for our health. We know this, and they also mean big streets that capture heat. And we already outlined what big problem that is. So we also have to see, it's kind of a double game. We remove the health hazard or the hazard to our well-being, and we put something in place that actually benefits. So I think that's quite a nice vision for the future, to have cities that look like that.
Thank you. Going away a little bit from mobility, I'd go further to housing, actually. Because we kind of have a problem in the city with people needing homes, and at the same time we kind of need space for those mitigation ideas. The question is kind of, is there a way to like combine both again in a synergy way, or do we just have to say, well, there's not enough space for everyone and everything within the city? And is it more of a, let's just rephrase it. If I listen to politicians, they always say, when we look at housing, well, we need to build. And is that from a mitigation point also the answer, or do we need to rethink it kind of and look at who is actually living within the city?
I can start. Of course, there's going to be detrimental effects to increasing urbanization in the city, and increasing the surface ceiling. Everything that we've talked about until now will, of course, worsen with the building in the city. I don't really want to myself touch on the issue of, do we need more housing? I think we do need more housing, and how much housing we need, I'm not the expert. But what we do when we build today, we can't build when we know, we can't build using standards from the past. That's just not possible. We know what the effects are. And so the good thing is, in Berlin, we have some new rules in place, some new regulations in place, which do not allow us to build as we did in the past. And one of these very important regulations restricts the amount of stormwater that can enter the sewage system or enter a surface water body from a new building site. So today, when you build in Berlin, you have to keep stormwater on site. And that means, and it doesn't matter how much space you have to keep it on site. And that means that you have to build a green roof. You have to build an infiltration swale, or you have to use stormwater, or you have to have storage and use it for some other purpose. There's no way around this rule. And so that when space is used, with this new rule, we can at least try to ensure that the situation that we have in Berlin today is not does not become more detrimental. That doesn't necessarily improve the situation we have today, and I think that improvement is also necessary. But we're at least try not to repeat the mistakes from the past. And I think that's one way that we can deal with increased housing. What we though see is that such approaches to stormwater management and building, they're expensive, and it's not the only rule in place which is increasing the price of housing. So we have climate protection rules that are climate protection. Yes, of course, we have energy demands. We have demands on the insulation of houses. We have demands on fire protection. We have demands on all kinds of things. And so what the reality is that all of these regulations and we have ecological building standards. And so all of these regulations, they're slowing down the building in Berlin. So we're not building at the rate that was initially intended, although we are building very quickly. But the building was supposed to be faster yet, and that's because the prices are high, and this slows down the investment ability of some companies, or the willingness to invest, one or the other. And so I think that maybe we will reach a point where we have the right amount of housing. I don't know. So these standards are definitely they're definitely pushing back on the increase in housing. However, I try to avoid the argument that we don't need housing. You know, housing against the other things. It may be necessary. I'm just not the expert, so I have a hard time discussing that one. But in any case, decreasing the negative effects of building is something that we work on daily.
Do you want to add something, Sophie?
Yeah, I maybe just can raise questions rather than answering them, because I'm not a city planner. But I think two questions that are interesting is how much space are we willing to give for cars or for other things? How there are like staggering numbers how many cars are parked at a time in cities. So how much space we leave daily to cars that are not even serving their purpose is an interesting question. And also thinking about, if we look around Berlin, which are the interesting, where do people want to live? And it's usually the ones that are outside because they're nice, but they're not super far away and have a terrible connection. So if we manage to get these connections very nicely, I think people might also choose to live a bit outside the city. So I think it's also about how we connect to the city, and then again also what was mentioned about hybrid forms of working, etc. That might make a change to that as well.
I think that's absolutely the case, but I also think that it's important to see that that this urban sprawl that we see in other areas of the world, this is not necessarily something that we want to have in Berlin. So if we don't build within the city, but we build around the city, then we are consuming soil, we are consuming space also outside of the city. I think it's also what's even more important than what we are doing when we build today. We can't make mistakes. We shouldn't make mistakes when we are building today. But what's even more important is looking around the city that is already built and seeing what potential there is to improve that. So as we increase the buildings that we have for living and for other purposes, of course, for schools, etc., we need to also at the same time look and see how we improve the built-up space that we have today. And there's so much room for improvement in the built-up space. There's so much potential for increasing the amount of green, for decreasing the amount of ceiling, for those people that are living in those areas, and not only creating nice new places. I think, and as I said, perhaps we don't need as many buildings as we think we need, and I'm curious to see where we will end.
All right, wonderful. Thanks. Yeah, I guess these discussions they can take on forever, and then it would be really interesting to have different views, but also different experts, especially on the housing question. I think this is something we will have on a national level, but also on a level of Berlin. More and more we'll have these discussions going on. So it's nice to already have like a peek into what we can discuss more about, maybe also during the conference that's going to happen. So then I have a question that I would first give to Sophie, and then also I would like to hear what Darla thinks about that. Going back from the measures, really just thinking about the impacts now. I mean, Berlin is a very diverse city with many different people in the city, different milieus, if we want to put it into these terms. So how do you think, just by what, even if we are really good at avoiding climate change, the climate crisis, and if we think about maybe we're not so good, so how do you think people are differently affected by in the city of Berlin by what's going to happen. How are they differently affected? Just by the effect. We can later talk about how solutions also affect people differently, but right now just let's keep it to the effects.
Yeah, I think so. There are these classic risk groups that are just defined by age. So the elderly and the very, very young, they are highly affected, both by heat waves, but also by pollution. And also, as we also saw in the pandemic, the people with pre-existing health conditions that are then much harder hit. And it's hard to see, but I think people who are having asthma living near to big roads do have trouble because it can be triggering for their asthma. And I think that leads to the next next group of people is that all these health risks like pollution, like heat, like living next to a big road with big of noise, these are the flats that are cheap in Berlin. So people that have not a lot of financial resources are more prone to be next to or environments that are just not well for their health. We know that flats around green spaces are more expensive and all of this. So and then we also know that socioeconomic status is linked to health outcomes, and so then we go back to the pre-existing health conditions, which have a connection with the socioeconomic status and the financial resources that there are. So I think these are big groups that we have to make sure we keep in mind when planning and adapting, but that's also the next step. So yes, I would say, and also maybe in addition as well, people that work outside are of course more affected. If you work outside during a heat wave, that's nearly impossible. So what are you going to do then? Are you not going to work? Are you going to work until you kind of drop? So I think there are different groups, and for different reasons they are likely to be more affected, and then we have to look clearly what is making them vulnerable in a way, or what is exposing them, and how can we change that.
All right, thanks. One follow-up here. So maybe a question, like looking at gender, do you see that there's an effect, that there's a differentiated impact from looking at gender? Because that's also one of your fields of where you look at.
I think gender impacts a lot of these underlying things. So health-seeking behavior or mental health is hugely impacted by gender. With mental health, there are really a lot of examples. Suicide risk is very different in men and women. So women attempt more suicide, but men complete more suicides, which is an interesting observation. And we also see that, I don't know, it depends a bit on what dynamics we look at, but in the health field, I think nearly many conditions are very different in men and women. And we also see that this whole, the risk factors concerning heart disease, lung disease, etc., that make them more vulnerable are also very different. So I can say something about that on the health side. On the other side, with on climate change, it's a bit hard to tell on a very local level whether there are dynamics. I'm very sure there are, but it's always a question on how disaggregated the data is and how easily you can tell. But in the health sector, I think it's very common for med students also to learn these illnesses are more common in men. These are more common in women. The medical system is often still very binary in the sense. And then we also have to ask, is this just by birth, or is it because we were taught certain things, like talking to a doctor or health-seeking behavior is definitely something we have learned growing up. So it's not a clear answer, I know, but I would say from the health side there is some differences. Yeah.
All right, great, thanks. Darla, do you want to add something regarding to how people are differently impacted?
I think that Sophie gave a very good picture of how the impact is on different social groups. What I think is interesting, though, is that it is in some sense the changes to climate can also be very egalitarian. There are some, the downtown part of Berlin, Mitte, which is highly coveted as a space to live, is highly impacted by heat. And there, I think there's a decoupling of this, which what you described is absolutely true. The big, noisy, heavily trafficked streets, comparing with the cheap housing and so on. But then again, if you look into some typical building situations that you have in Berlin with what they call Zeilenbebauung, or these rows of apartment houses where you have these green spaces in between, and the parking takes place elsewhere. These are also rather inexpensive forms of housing, but they have, when you look at climate change, they are less affected. They have better air quality. They have less heat stress. And so it's not always really a clear picture with what I've described. And in any case, flooding affects everyone. There's no group which is more or less affected by flooding. Of course, those that can move more quickly are less, can get away from the flooding. So of course there are going to be groups that are perhaps more at risk by flooding. Also, older, the very young. But flooding can show up anywhere in the city that is highly sealed. And so I think that there are some, the climate crisis will really affect everyone. Yeah, and I can't really say the gender question, I think, is very interesting. I haven't thought about it enough, with the point of view that I take regarding climate change. So I think I'll pass on that one, but I'll definitely think about it afterwards.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. So regarding looking at the time, Johannes, do you have another question to the two of you, because we are already going into the roundup leading to the convergence of today.
Sure. But before I ask the next question, I just wanted to point out that maybe people are infected by flooding at the same time, but it all obviously also depends on how can you build up everything afterwards and how much money do you have in reserve. So maybe that's something to look at also. I do have a question to Sophie again, and it's how do we manage to adapt to diverse climate-induced risks in a socially just way and not cut back on the equality of urban life? We already striped it a little bit, but maybe to go deeper.
So what I think what I outlined already is that I think the current distribution of environmental hazard is already quite unjust. And I would say, even though I agree that it's not as clear cut, it might also get even worse for the already worse off if we don't mitigate. And one thing that Berlin has actually done, which I find quite interesting, is that they have a climate justice map where they actually map climate and health risks and very traditional public health risks as pollution and noise and heat, and map them onto socioeconomic status. And I think that's really good because we have to start investing somewhere, and that we should look at where is it needed the most, because there might be citizens that are very loud and saying we want green spaces, but are these really the citizens that need it first? And I think that's a good way to go about it. And of course, I think financing or the way we finance this can be done in very different ways. I only had basic economics in my master's, but there are ways to tax or to get money that are everyone has to pay the same, or those have to pay more that have actually more income. And I think if we use financial instruments that kind of equal it out a bit and do not put pressure on those who are already struggling, this is a good way to finance these measures. Yeah, so I would say, yeah, we need a bit data, but we also don't have to go there. We shouldn't stay stuck at the data stage, but we we should look at who, where, and how we need it the most first. And I think this can weigh out a lot of inequality that we at the moment are just, yeah, that there is already at the moment, and then we can make it actually better with the measures we have.
Thank you. Dalla, do you want to add something?
Nothing other than that I'm really glad that you measure the climate justice map, because I wanted to talk about it before, but I couldn't think about its name or what to call it in English. So thank you for that.
Great. So maybe Sophie, if you have the link, you can put it into the chat. That would be great. Yeah, Yannick.
No, that was exactly my question, because Isabella asked for it, and I think it would be very interesting also for the others. Yeah. Thank you.
That's really
Actually, I have to correct myself. It's environmental justice map, not climate justice map, but I think both feeds into it. There you go.
Yeah, that's right. It's called Umweltgerechtigkeit, and it can be found.
Okay, wonderful. I think there are a lot of good examples. I know that I had some friends who worked on a project that was called Where is my Madrid, or Where is my Stockholm, and Where is my London? So people were really talking about what places they like most, what place. And if you add this to the climate change issue, and then also think about who actually needs these spaces most, then it can become something very interesting. So thanks for sharing also this idea. So we're, like I told you, we are going into the closing, but before that, I would like to ask you to get yourself ready to move a bit. We would like to knock onto the screen without actually knocking onto the screen, to get ourselves all again into a moment of focus and concentration. You can knock, and then you could actually see that your screen is not really, it's kind of dirty. So with the other hand, try to wipe the screen. So one hand knocking and one hand wiping. And then we would like to change it quickly. So we would like to knock and wipe with the other hand. So we can change again, knock and wipe. And one last time, knock and wipe. Very good. So thanks a lot. Wonderful. I hope everyone has been knocked awake and has a very clean and smooth screen now. To go, very good, Yannick, to go into the last round. And for the last round, we have a final question to our two experts who have already shared many, many very interesting insights so far, and that's wonderful. Again, you see Yannick with a highly concentrated face. Nothing of this is actually lost. We will go to that later on, but Yannick is taking protocol of this so we can use it later for the conference and so on, but we will talk about that later. So the last question for the two of you is actually, yeah, what is your vision for a Berlin-proof city 2030? And before we go into that vision, I would like to ask every one of you to think of one place in Berlin or one idea or one concept that kind of refers to your vision of 2030, Berlin in 2030. Kind of, this is kind of something that you think is already a good start. This kind of reflects what you feel like. So this is an invitation to everyone. Write down one, you can write it down on a paper, write down one place, one idea, one example of what you would like to see more in 2030 in Berlin. It could be anything. It could be a small place, could be the flower outside your doorstep.
Writing or drawing?
You can draw, of course, Yannick. You're more than welcome to draw, but actually the idea is that you can write it, but if you feel like it's easier.
Yeah, I prefer that. Yeah.
Okay, you have 1 minute time for that, and then we go into the closing of Sophie and Dala, and the rest of us has some time to share afterwards. Okay, I see some people still writing. I would say, yeah. So Dala and Sophie, maybe first Dala and then Sophie. So what is your vision? Maybe you can start even with what you've put down, and what's your vision and for climate-proof Berlin 2030, and also for you actually, what are the next urgent steps forward? If you could say like, okay, this could or should happen today, or next year or tomorrow. So Stala.
Okay, and I can also mention what place I think about. Yeah, first. Or...
Yes, of course.
I can't think. I think of many. I hope I'm allowed to mention a few. The one I would like to draw people's attention to is a new building site called 52 Degrees North, which was built in the last years. Has a beautiful retention pond in the middle and a number of different measures for stormwater management to implement the sponge city approach. It's situated directly on the Dahme in Köpenick. It's really just, when you go there and you see what it feels like to live in that environment, it's just great. I just highly recommend it. But there are so many building projects which have taken place over the last 20 years, which show how this approach can be taken. The Weiberwirtschaft, Malzfabrik, Block 6. I could just go on. And there's the Ökologische Stadtplan, which is published by the city of Berlin, which has a map and it shows where all of these places are, and you can and it also has little pictures about them, and I recommend that as well, to go and feel what it feels like, because you can really feel the different the quality in such environments. That's what it's all about. So my vision, I think I said it before, but I can pack a few numbers behind it. I think that 10% of public space could be turned into public paved space, so space that is now used for plazas, for streets, for pavement, for sidewalks, should be changed into green space in the next 10 years, and this green space should be used not only for stormwater management intentionally, but and also to reduce the amount of stormwater runoff. But it should have some kind of multifunctional use. So there should also be a space that is used either for recreation or used for planting trees, or used to improve our quality of life in the city, not just for stormwater management, because space is too restricted in the city. That would be my vision, that we really start to change our urban spaces, our public spaces, and in 10 years, 10% in downtown area. That's my vision.
Great, thanks, Sophie.
Yeah, I can go on. So one place I thought about that is right where I live is, I'm not sure if you know it, it's called the Zentrum für Kunst und Urbanistik, which is an old Güterbahnhof, where I really don't know how to translate that in English. So train shed or something in that way. And I really like it because it's not used anymore, but it got transformed into something very nicely. So it's a space where a lot of different people meet in the evenings. There's greenery, there's urban gardening where people can come together and garden. There are some kind of tables where you can bring your picnic and have dinner. And they also do some social events. And I think, yeah, this is the future that I would see. So it's very green. It's very with a close social connection. So right now we're keeping apart for our health, but we all know that we feel much better if we can meet up and have close social connections and build community. And I think this is a bit how I would see it, that we transform these spaces so that they benefit our communities. And yes, what I see in the future is that in health policy, there's this idea of bringing health into all kind of areas, so that we don't only talk about hospitals, that we consider health in different policy fields. And I would think that if we consider health and equity and climate in all policy fields, which I do know is a lot, but I can then only imagine a very good city, a very good life. And I think this would be something to look forward to, and to make a very green and social city.
Right. Thank you very much for the inspirations. So we are running out of time, so I would quickly like to hear, actually, out of curiosity, maybe from a few more people, what their places were. So feel free either to write it in the chat, or raise your hand and your voice to share. You don't have to explain it in detail, but just feel free what you want to share. Isabella, it's very hard to read.
Bit like Britzergärten? No, yes.
Okay, nice.
Yeah, I just put that garden because, or the park, because it was designed actually. So it has kind of artificial hills, and the thought behind it was that all the different nature that is normally in that area would grow into the structure and flourish that way. So I think that's a really cool model to think about our cities, because obviously we've built everything, which means we also have the power to change it and sort of like see it just as part of the landscape, that we can adjust to be better for our health and our planet's health, because they really are the same issue in a lot of ways.
Thank you, Isabella. Anyone else? Any more spaces, places you want to share? Right. Then I'll quickly share mine. I thought this is lame because I refer to the, not to the Tempelhofer Feld as such, but actually to the long grass in the Tempelhofer Feld. And I thought about sitting there during summer, and it doesn't, for me, it shows how much a place can be at the same time if there's a way of thinking about all these things. And then it can be a field that feels like it's burned, but depending on the way you manage it or leave it manage itself, it can also become a place that is really able to absorb in a positive way some of the heat. So I feel like sitting there during a hot evening, it can feel already cool when the sun is down because of the ecosystem around it. So this is kind of the vision of letting maybe part of nature also manage itself. That's my space. Wonderful. If there are no more places, as I've seen, then Johannes and Yannick, let's go into the checkout closing.
Okay. So we could have asked so many more questions. You don't know it, but we have a few more. We could have dived into so many more topics. It was really nice with you and to hear all those things and to get a part of your expertise. I'm really happy that this was the last climate talk. It was a good final, I would say. And I'm happy that we are going to see at least a few people back on the conference from the 17th to the 18th of June. So you can register now, as Yannick told us already. But for today, I'd hand over to Yannick so he can give us a little view on the mirror board where he collected all the things we've said during the last 90 minutes.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Also, again, from my side to the speakers, let me quickly share my screen with you. I hope you can see this now. On the mirror board, as I explained already before, we have developed this board over the course of the 6 climate talks that you can see, and we have created a lot of input. It's always a good sign when you run out of space and you have to create additional spaces to fit all the input that is there. Just a quick walkthrough to today's talk. We have talked a lot about what climate-related health risks there are, really, with great input from both the speakers. We talked about heat waves, vector-borne diseases, and of course extreme weather events. We also talked an aspect that was pointed out by Sophie, which I found very, very important and very striking, is that the extent of what is coming is in our hands. We also talked, of course, about measures to minimize that dramatic impacts of the changing climate conditions in the city, and a number of measures were mentioned here. I really wrote down here the keyword preparedness in many different ways. Dala pointed out the role of rainwater as a resource in so many different ways, especially pertaining to the model of the sponge city. But we also talked about unsealing, a lot about green spaces. Once again, many connections, by the way, to other action areas of the BEK 2030s, especially buildings and urban development and transport. We also talked a lot about transport and generally about changing urban space. And then there were a couple of questions, open questions, also from the audience. Thank you again for that one. We also compared the climate crisis to Corona, similarities and differences. And we also mentioned, I think it was mentioned by Dala, that the pandemic actually showed us how quickly we are able to adapt. So it's also a question of willingness. Prevention is the best medicine. And we also talked about the health infrastructure, of course, and the way we need to change how we build hospitals, but also I think there was a very nice point made by Sophie again, how we need to consider health, equity, and climate in all different policy fields. And last but not least, we have some very practical examples. For example, the Berlin Environmental Justice Map on urban life quality. We talked also about different groups of the society being differently affected. And last but not least, the ecologic city map, which was also mentioned by Dala. So thank you so very, very much for this great and valuable input.
Well, thank you, Yannick. And I'll give the last words to Sophie and Dala. If you want to say something, you don't have to. And you don't have to say that you liked it. You can also say that you hated it. And what we can do better, actually, it's nice to get feedback as well. So yeah.
Yeah, I just wrote it into the chat, actually, that I really enjoyed this format. And I think, I mean, I organized so many workshops and video conferences myself, but I learned a lot about how to do that today better. I enjoyed it immensely, and I really enjoyed being an expert together with Sophie. I learned a lot from you today, too. So thank you for this. I would definitely like to participate again.
Yeah, I can only agree. I really liked the format and the little breaks that were built in. I'll kind of keep that for the next conferences. And I really liked the format and the discussion, and I also learned a lot. I actually know very little to nothing about rain. As someone said before, it just comes and I don't think about it. And so it was really, really great to talk to you, Dala, and to learn a lot about it. And I loved also the questions from the audience. So thanks for organizing this.
Okay, I have to speak one last time. I'm so sorry. I promised you'd be the last people to talk. But yeah, thanks a lot again. Maybe we'll see each other at the conference, because there's no more talk for this year, and the next one will be the conference. So see you maybe there. Have a good evening, have a good night, whatever you're going to do. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.